Brian Johnson's name has become inseparable from the towering legend of AC/DC. For millions of fans across the globe, he was the voice that picked up the pieces after Bon Scott's death in 1980 and carried the band into its most commercially successful era. But what if the reality wasn't as heroic as the myth suggests? What if Johnson himself saw his role not as the conquering savior of AC/DC, but as a cog in a machine he didn't control? A puppet bound by the strings of a band that valued obedience more than individuality. For decades, the narrative has been polished to perfection. That Johnson came in, blasted out Back in Black, and instantly became the new face and sound of the group. Yet when you dig deeper into Johnson's own words, into the whispers within the industry, and into the history of AC/DC's rigid inner workings, a very different picture emerges. It's a story of control, of silence, and of a man who gave his all to a band but was often treated as disposable. This is the myth Brian Johnson has destroyed, and it shakes the foundations of what so many believed about AC/DC. To understand why Johnson would ever describe himself as a puppet, we have to look back at the strange and almost brutal way AC/DC has always handled its frontmen. Bon Scott was never just a singer. He was the charismatic wild man whose lyrics, humor, and attitude defined the band's identity in the 1970s. His partnership with Angus and Malcolm Young was symbiotic. He wasn't just singing the words, he was shaping them. After Scott's sudden death in February 1980, the band faced an impossible challenge. How do you continue when the man who embodied your essence is gone? They turned to Brian Johnson, a Geordie rocker known mainly for his work with the band Geordie, who had the raw vocal power to match AC/DC's thunderous sound. But here's where the myth begins. Johnson wasn't brought in to shape the future of the band. He wasn't asked to co-write the blueprint of the next era. Instead, he was slotted in, handed lyrics largely built from Bon's notebooks or the Young brothers' ideas, and told to deliver with his voice alone. From the very beginning, the hierarchy was clear. This was Malcolm and Angus's band, and Johnson was a hired weapon. The clearest evidence of this power structure came with the creation of Back in Black, one of the most successful rock albums of all time. For decades, fans debated how much of the album's lyrical content belonged to Bon Scott, who had been working on songs with the Young brothers before his death. AC/DC has always been tight-lipped about this, but what's undeniable is that Brian Johnson had virtually no input in the songwriting. His job was to sing, not to speak. In interviews years later, Johnson admitted he was told very directly not to get involved in the writing process. He was given melodies and words, and the task was to roar them out with conviction. That's not the story fans like to hear. The myth painted him as stepping in with creative fire, but Johnson himself repeatedly suggested otherwise. He was not the architect, he was the instrument. And that silence he maintained for years about his limited role is part of what now feels like a confession, that he was nothing more than a puppet in one of the biggest rock machines of all time. Then in 1983, when the band released Flick of the Switch, the cracks in the myth started to show. Johnson was credited as a lyricist for the first time, but even then, the material bore the unmistakable stamp of the Young brothers' rigid control. Critics slammed the album for lacking the lyrical spark Bon Scott had once provided. Fans noticed that Johnson's personality never seemed to seep into the words. By 1988, with the release of Blow Up Your Video, Johnson's role in songwriting had all but disappeared again. Angus and Malcolm had grown more protective of their creative domain, and Brian was relegated strictly to performing. This cycle of brief involvement followed by erasure would define his decades in the band. Unlike Bon Scott, who sparred with the Youngs, wrote with them, and stamped his personality on every verse, Johnson was consistently shut out of that process. For a man who had been hailed as the savior of AC/DC, the reality was bitterly different. He was indispensable on stage, but expendable at the drawing board. What's most striking about Johnson's candid reflections later in life is the sense of resignation. He admitted in interviews that he wasn't a songwriter, that the Youngs didn't want him meddling in their formula. At first, this humility seemed like a badge of honor. He was just happy to be there. But as the years dragged on, that humility began to sound more like a confession of frustration. Imagine being the frontman of one of the world's greatest rock bands, but knowing your contributions to its creative identity would never be taken seriously. Imagine having the fans chant your name, yet behind closed doors, feeling voiceless. That's the contradiction Brian Johnson lived with, and it's why today he can speak so openly about feeling like a puppet. And then came the ultimate humiliation in 2016. Johnson, struggling with severe hearing loss, was told he could no longer tour with AC/DC. Instead of giving him time to recover or working around his limitations, the band announced he was being replaced by none other than Axl Rose. The news stunned the rock world. Here was a man who had carried AC/DC for 36 years, and he was suddenly discarded like a broken tool. Johnson himself described the experience as devastating, saying he felt as if his life's work had been ripped away overnight. Fans rallied behind him, outraged at the coldness of the decision. But within the AC/DC machine, sentimentality had no place. The Young brothers had always treated the band like a business, and Johnson had always been an employee, not a partner. In that moment, the myth was shattered for millions. The frontman they thought was irreplaceable was, in the eyes of the band, just another part that could be swapped out, a puppet with cut strings. What makes this story even more powerful is that Brian Johnson has never lashed out in bitterness. He never trashed the Youngs publicly, never sought revenge. But in his autobiography and rare interviews, the truth slipped out between the lines. He spoke about being sidelined creatively, about being told not to interfere, about feeling gutted when the band replaced him. These aren't the words of a man who saw himself as a conquering hero. They're the words of someone who knows he was controlled. And in that knowledge lies the destruction of the AC/DC myth. The story wasn't one of triumph and reinvention. It was one of sacrifice and subjugation. Johnson gave his soul to AC/DC, but he wasn't allowed to shape its heart. When you peel back the layers of AC/DC's history, you begin to see just how carefully the myth has been managed. The Young brothers, Angus and Malcolm, were not just musicians. They were architects of control. From the very beginning, they believed in a closed circle where decisions were made by family. Loyalty was to blood, and everyone else was simply along for the ride. Even drummers, bassists, and managers felt the weight of this system. But for Brian Johnson, the imbalance was more profound, because he was the literal voice of the band, the face fans saw night after night. And yet he was excluded from the very process that gave those words and riffs life. This wasn't an accident. It was design. Johnson's role was to execute, never to innovate. And that's why his later revelations about being treated like a puppet sting with such force. They're not exaggerations. They're acknowledgments of a system that was built to keep him in line. Then in 1990, everything changed again when AC/DC released The Razor's Edge. He had to choose between speaking up and risking his place, or staying quiet and preserving the paycheck, the fame, and the bond with fans. He chose silence for decades, and that silence kept the AC/DC myth alive. It's here that Brian's story takes on almost Shakespearean weight. He was the loyal servant, adored by the crowd, yet bound to masters who never let him rise beyond his designated station. The tragedy is not just that he was used, but that he accepted it. When he finally broke that silence and admitted the truth, that he often felt like a puppet, it was as if a dam had burst. Fans realized that the smiling frontman they thought was living the dream had in fact been living under control. The very myth that kept AC/DC's machine intact. The idea that Brian Johnson was the equal of Bon Scott, a full-fledged partner in the band's destiny, crumbled under the weight of his own words. Another crucial turning point came in 2008 with the release of Black Ice. It was hailed as a late-career triumph, and Johnson once again stood at the center of the storm, belting out tracks like Rock and Roll Train. Yet, behind the scenes, little had changed. The Youngs still controlled the songwriting. Johnson's role was once more reduced to interpreting their words and melodies. In interviews promoting the album, he admitted cheerfully that he hadn't written the songs, that he just sang what was given to him. To casual fans, this seemed like harmless humility, but to those listening closely, it sounded more like a confession of resignation. Here was a man who had been the voice of AC/DC for nearly 3 decades, yet he was still talking like a hired hand, still positioning himself as an outsider in the creative process. That's not the myth fans wanted to hear, but it was the reality Johnson could no longer avoid revealing. Then in 2014, the situation turned darker with the decline of Malcolm Young's health. Malcolm's dementia forced him to step away, and Stevie Young stepped in to fill the rhythm guitar slot. For the first time, AC/DC's foundation was shaken. Brian Johnson, who had always respected Malcolm's authority, now faced a slightly different dynamic. But even with Malcolm gone, the system of control didn't break. Angus assumed the mantle as the unquestioned leader, and Brian remained the voice without a voice. The band soldiered on with rock or bust, but the storm clouds were gathering. By this point, Johnson was in his late 60s, and the physical demands of touring were wearing him down. His hearing problems grew worse, and eventually they reached a breaking point. In 2016, the bombshell hit. Johnson was being pulled from the tour, and AC/DC was bringing in Axl Rose to finish the shows. The way Johnson was sidelined remains one of the coldest moves in rock history. Imagine devoting 36 years of your life to a band, carrying them through decades of ups and downs, only to be discarded the moment your health falters. Johnson described it as one of the darkest periods of his life. He admitted to feeling heartbroken, humiliated, and cut adrift. Fans were outraged not just because he was replaced, but because of the way it was handled. With cold efficiency, without gratitude, without respect for the man who had been the face of AC/DC for nearly 4 decades. If ever there was proof that Johnson was viewed as a puppet by the band's leadership, this was it. When the puppet could no longer perform, the strings were cut, and a new puppet was brought in. That image alone destroyed the myth of brotherhood, loyalty, and family that AC/DC had always projected. This is where Johnson's story becomes something more than just a tale of rock and roll. It's a cautionary tale about the nature of power in the music industry. Fans want to believe in myths, heroes who step up, conquer adversity, and reshape history. But behind the curtain, the truth is often harsher. Bands like AC/DC run on control, on hierarchy, on tightly managed images. And sometimes, the people who appear to be the most powerful, the frontmen, the stars, are in fact the least empowered of all. Brian Johnson's destruction of the AC/DC myth is not just about his own role, but about exposing how the entire machine operates. It's a machine that consumes, controls, and discards, all while maintaining the illusion of unity and brotherhood. What makes Brian Johnson's story so remarkable is the duality it represents. On one hand, he is the voice of one of the biggest-selling rock albums in history, Back in Black, a record that has sold over 50 million copies worldwide. His scream on the title track is as immortal as any sound in rock. His performances on stage became legendary, from Donington to River Plate, where entire stadiums of hundreds of thousands sang back every word he belted out. To the public, he was the undisputed frontman, the man who proved AC/DC could survive the death of Bon Scott and still conquer the world. And yet, on the other hand, Brian himself reveals that he never felt like he was truly steering the ship. He wasn't the lyricist. He wasn't the visionary. He was, as he put it, little more than a puppet, brought in to execute a role within a machine that was bigger than him. That duality is what makes his revelations so powerful. They destroy the fairy tale image of triumph and instead reveal a human being wrestling with invisibility inside the very spotlight that defined his life. But here's where the story becomes even more compelling. Johnson may have been a puppet in the mechanics of AC/DC, but he was never a puppet to the fans. To them, he was always authentic. When he walked on stage in his newsboy cap, with his gravelly grin and his unstoppable energy, fans didn't care who wrote the lyrics. They cared that Brian Johnson was delivering them like his life depended on it. That's where the paradox lies. Johnson was both a puppet and a hero. The band may have controlled him, but the fans saw through that and made him their own. They loved him not because of what he wrote, but because of how he lived every note he sang. And that's why, even as he destroys the myth, he remains beloved. The puppet may not have controlled the strings, but he animated them with such fire that people believed he was free. In that contradiction lies Brian Johnson's true legacy. Today, as Brian Johnson enters his twilight years, his voice may not soar the way it once did, but his revelations echo louder than ever. He has destroyed the myth not out of spite, but out of honesty. He has shown that behind the stadium lights and the screaming crowds, there can exist a silence, a suppression, a loss of agency. And yet, even within that silence, there was greatness. He may have been a puppet, but he was the greatest puppet rock and roll has ever seen, because he made those strings come alive in a way no one else could. Fans can both mourn the myth and celebrate the man. They can accept that he was controlled, while also recognizing that without him, AC/DC would never have soared as high as it did. That's the paradox of Brian Johnson's legacy. Both disposable and indispensable, both silenced and unforgettable. And so the story ends not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of triumph. Brian Johnson destroyed the myth, yes. He revealed the puppet strings, he exposed the hierarchy, he admitted the pain. But in doing so, he liberated himself from the illusion. He no longer has to play the role of the conquering hero. He can simply be Brian Johnson, the man who gave his voice to the world, even when the words weren't his. And in that honesty, in that raw destruction of the myth, lies something more powerful than the legend ever was. The truth. A truth that fans can finally see clearly, even if it's uncomfortable. A truth that makes Brian Johnson's journey not just one of rock and roll glory, but of human resilience, sacrifice, and survival.